The wind in the Wyoming Territory had a name for every season. In winter, it was a blade. In summer, a furnace breath. And in the spring of 1886, it was a thief. It stole the moisture from the ground, the warmth from a man's bones, and the hope from any soul not properly anchored. It swept through Bitterwash, a narrow valley squeezed between limestone bluffs, carrying red dust that settled into every crack and crease of life. The dust was on the sills of the one-room cabin that served as Abigail Finch's home and schoolhouse, and it was in the lines around her eyes as she stood by the well. She was 28, a widow for 2 years, and the sole heir to a small ranch that was more trouble than property. She worked the windlass, its groan a familiar complaint, and drew up the bucket. It was an old wooden bucket, and a long crack ran down its side like a scar. By the time she hauled it to the trough for her 2 horses and single milk cow, a quarter of the water was gone, leaving a dark, snaking trail in the dust behind her. She watched the last of it soak into the parched earth. Another thing broken, another thing to fix. Her gaze drifted past the meager barn to the fence line, where a corner post leaned like a tired old man. Everything leaned here, it seemed, leaned on her. Inside, the air was still and smelled of chalk dust, old paper, and the faint, lingering scent of her father's pipe tobacco. The room was dominated by the cottonwood desk he had built with his own hands. It was a massive, practical piece of furniture, and it was the center of her divided world. On the left side lay the ranch ledger, its pages filled with her precise, compact handwriting. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. A column of expenses that grew like a stubborn weed, and a column of income that was sparse and timid. A notice from the bank in Cheyenne was tucked into the front cover, its formal language a polite threat. On the right side of the desk, a neat stack of McGuffey's readers and slates awaited the half-dozen children who would trickle in tomorrow for the start of the seasonal school. Teaching them was a small but steady income, and more than that, it was a promise she had made to their parents and to herself. She would keep this place. She would rebuild the barn her late husband had started. She would pay the bank its due, and she would give these children a foothold in a world that was growing bigger and faster every day. A woman, the whispers in town said, could not hold a ranch. Abigail intended to prove them wrong. One cracked bucket and leaning post at a time. Miles away, a man walked into the valley. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long roads and empty bellies. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, and the wide brim of his hat was bent into a permanent wave. A pale, puckered scar cut a line across his cheekbone, pulling the corner of his eye into a perpetual squint. His name was Eli Cutter, a name he used as sparingly as he used words. He was about 32 years old. Though the trail had carved a few extra years onto his face, he was a carpenter by trade and had been a guard on a mail coach. 2 professions that taught a man to be watchful and to understand the ways things could fall apart. His eyes took in Bitterwash not as a landscape, but as a collection of problems. A loose board on the general store's porch, a sagging roof on the livery, the cant of Abigail Finch's corner post. He saw the woman at the well, the dark path the leaking bucket left in the dirt. He saw the inefficiency, the waste. He saw work to be done. He kept his head lowered as he walked down the town's single dusty street. He needed a meal and a roof for a few nights, a place to let the past settle before it stirred up again. He felt the weight of a hidden past, a thing as real and heavy as the worn tool roll in his pack. A place like Bitterwash could be a haven or it could be a trap, and he had learned that the two often looked the same at first. The man who wanted to own the valley, Silas Merrick, sat in the saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a cattleman, but his real business was debt. He owned the largest herd for 100 miles, but he also owned notes on half the small ranches and businesses in the county. He spoke in a low, reasonable voice that made his ambition sound like common sense. "The railroad is coming," he said to the men around his table. "Surveyors were through last month. This land, He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire valley. "Is going to be worth something. A man has to be ready to take an opportunity when it presents itself." Next to him, Deputy Crane nodded slowly. Crane was a man whose body had gone soft, but whose eyes had stayed hard. He spent more time in the saloon at Merrick's side than he did upholding any law that did not serve Merrick's interests. He listened as Merrick talked about consolidating the grazing lands, about how inefficient these small, struggling spreads were, about how some folks just were not cut out to manage property, especially a lone woman. A few tables away, a man named Jeb Hollis watched them, his face unreadable. Hollis was a bounty hunter, a man who drifted in and out of town following the scent of paper and coin. He had a memory for faces and for the descriptions on wanted posters. His gaze flicked toward the saloon doors as Eli Cutter passed by, a brief, assessing glance before he returned to his beer. The talk of the railroad was a constant hum in Bitter Wash. It promised progress and brought speculators. But for people like Abigail, it was just another source of pressure. The bank wanted its money now, before the railroad potentially changed everything. The town council, swayed by Merrick's influence and money, did little to protect the smaller landowners. The world was pressing in on Bitter Wash, and Abigail felt its weight most keenly. The ground itself seemed to betray her. The water in the well was lower than it had ever been in her memory, a sign of the deep thirst of a dry summer to come. At night, she heard the howls of wolves, closer now than they had been in years, drawn down from the high country by the scent of cattle. Nature and man seemed allied against her. She hated the thought of hiring a hand. It was an admission of defeat, another expense in her blood-red ledger. More than that, she despised the idea of depending on a stranger, of letting another person's whims and reliability dictate the fate of her home. But the barn would not rebuild itself, and the fences would not stand against the weight of Merrick's herd without a strong back to set the posts. The conflict was a knot in her stomach, her need for help warring with her fear of dependence. Eli, nursing a lukewarm coffee in the town's small cafe, felt a similar war within himself. He could see the work that needed doing everywhere he looked. He had hands that knew how to fix things, to make them strong and true. He could find a place here, earn his keep, but to stay meant to be known. It meant questions, and it meant putting down roots. However shallow, roots could tangle a man, hold him in one place long enough for his past to find him. He needed shelter, but he feared the very thing that offered it: community, connection, the simple act of being seen. For now, the two of them, the woman who feared dependence and the man who feared connection, circled each other from a distance, their problems as plain as the dust on the wind. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the western bluffs, the trouble Abigail had been expecting arrived. It came not as a man on horseback or a letter from the bank, but as a low, rumbling sound, the splintering of wood. She stepped out of her cabin, the shotgun her father had left her held loosely in her hands. In the fading light, she saw them. A dozen of Merrick's steers were pushing against her fence line, their heavy bodies treating the leaning posts like kindling. This was no accident. It had happened twice before. The cattle trampling the small patch of garden she was trying to nurture, muddying the creek that was her only source of water beyond the failing well. A cold, clear anger rose in her. It burned away the weariness and the worry. She walked steadily toward the fence, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. She was not a fool. She knew shooting a steer, even on her own land, would bring a world of trouble down on her. But she was done being quiet. She was done being pushed. Raising the heavy gun to her shoulder, she aimed not at the cattle, but at the vast, indifferent sky. She squeezed the trigger. The blast was a physical blow, a deafening roar that ripped through the quiet evening. It echoed off the limestone cliffs, a sound of defiance. The steers, startled, bellowed and scattered, crashing back through the broken fence and lumbering away into the dusk. The ringing in her ears slowly faded, replaced by the thumping of her own heart. A movement on the low ridge overlooking her property caught her eye. A lone rider sat on his horse, a silhouette against the last vestiges of daylight. She did not need to see his face to know who it was. Deputy Crane. He did not move or call out. He simply sat there, watching her. The distance was too great to make out his features, but she felt the force of his gaze, a cold, hostile weight. It was not the look of a lawman observing a dispute. It was the look of an enemy taking measure. In that silent, heavy moment, Abigail Finch understood that she had not just scared off a few cattle. She had fired the first shot in a war she was not sure she could win. The silence that followed the shotgun blast was heavier than the noise had been. Abigail stood in the gathering dark, the warm weight of the gun a strange comfort in her hands. She watched Deputy Crane's silhouette on the ridge for a long minute before he turned his horse and vanished. He had delivered his message without a word. She had delivered hers with a bang. She reloaded the shotgun, a methodical, practiced motion, and went inside, barring the door. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake listening to the wind, which had begun to rise again, this time with a new, menacing voice. It was a low moan that grew into a persistent howl, rattling the window frame and finding its way through the chinks in the cabin walls. Sometime after midnight, the real assault began. It was not rain, but dust. A fine, gritty powder forced its way under the door and through the window sash, coating everything with a film of red. The wind slammed against the small cabin, a relentless, physical force. She rose and lit a lamp, its flame fluttering wildly in the drafts. Through the window, she could see nothing but a swirling, opaque world of dirt. The sound was terrifying, a constant, grinding roar. Then came a new sound, a sharp crack like a breaking bone, followed by the splintering groan of tortured wood. It came from the direction of the barn, wrapping a scarf over her nose and mouth. She took the lamp and fought her way outside. The wind tore at her, nearly ripping the door from her hand. The air was thick and suffocating, each breath an act of will. In the lamp's unsteady glow, she saw the damage. A huge section of the barn roof had been ripped away, the old, weathered planks scattered like matchsticks. The remaining structure shuddered with each gust. The milk cow bellowed in terror, her eyes wide. Abigail's 2 horses stamped nervously in their stalls. One of the main crossbeams, weakened by rot she had never had the time or money to fix, had snapped. A large section of the remaining roof sagged precariously, held up by little more than habit. If it came down, it would crush the animals and destroy what little was left of the barn. She saw a loose plank flapping wildly, threatening to tear away and take more of the roof with it. Gritting her teeth against the stinging dust, she found a foothold on a feed trough and fought her way up, her skirts whipping around her. She grabbed the flapping board, the rough wood tearing at her hands, and tried to hold it against the force of the gale. It was a fool's errand. The wind was a giant, invisible hand, and she was a fly. Her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned. The board bucked in her grip, pulling her forward. Just as her strength gave out, a shape materialized out of the red gloom. A man. He was tall and gaunt, moving with a staggering gait, but he moved with purpose. Without a word, he lunged for the sagging crossbeam, putting his shoulder under it and bracing his legs. The wood groaned, but it held. He turned his head, and in the flickering lamplight she saw the scar on his cheek, the exhaustion in his eyes. It was Eli Cutter. He looked even more ragged and worn than he had in town, half-starved and beaten down by the storm. "The board," he rasped, his voice rough with dust. "Let it go! The beam is the danger!" She let go, scrambling down from her perch. The wind immediately ripped the plank away, sending it cartwheeling into the darkness. But the main beam was steady, held by the stranger's strength. He was braced against the pillar of the storm, a lone figure holding back chaos. For a long moment, they stayed like that, a tableau in the heart of the tempest. The woman with the lamp, the man holding up the roof, the terrified animals huddled in the shadows. The wind howled its fury, but inside the broken barn, for the first time that night, something held. The storm blew itself out by dawn, leaving a world remade in red dust. The sun rose on a landscape of weary silence. Eli Cutter sat slumped against the beam he had held for hours, his eyes closed. He was asleep, or perhaps unconscious. Abigail brought him a dipper of water from the leaking bucket. He drank it greedily, the water leaving clean streaks through the mask of grime on his face. "I need work," he said, his voice clearer now. "I can fix this for a meal." Abigail looked at the ruin of her barn, then at the man. He was a drifter, the kind her father had always warned her about. But he had not run from the storm. He had run into it. She looked at his hands. They were calloused and capable, a carpenter's hands. Tucked into his belt was a small, worn leather pouch. As he shifted, the morning light caught it, revealing the faint, faded stencil of an eagle and the letters U.S. Mail. A mail guard? She knew what that meant. It meant trouble often rode on your trail. But right now, the storm was the bigger trouble. One day, she said, "Let me see what you can do. There's coffee on the stove and what's left of a loaf of bread." He ate like a man who had not seen food in days, but with a quiet dignity, not grabbing or gulping. Afterward, he set to work. He moved with a sureness that was mesmerizing to watch. He salvaged every usable plank, pulled every bent nail, and patiently straightened it on a flat stone. The town was a mess after the storm, and a large wooden sign had been torn from its posts at the edge of town and blown nearly to her property line. Eli dragged it back to the barn. It was the town's no speeding sign, meant to slow down wagons. He sawed it into sections, using the sturdy, seasoned wood to patch the gaping hole in the barn door. As he hammered the last piece into place, he looked over at her, a rare glint of humor in his tired eyes. Figured a no speeding sign was just the thing to keep cattle from making a run for it. The dry wit of it, in the midst of all this hardship, caught her off guard. A small smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like weeks. He worked through the day, shoring up the beam, securing the remaining roof, and making the structure sound, if not pretty. That evening, as he finished, Abigail went into the cabin and returned with a single silver dollar she had kept hidden in the tea canister. It was her last bit of solid currency. She held it out to him. "You earned more than this," she said, "but it's all I have." He looked at the coin in her palm, then at her face. He shook his head. "A bowl of that stew I smell and a spot in the hayloft is payment enough. I held up a roof. I did not save a life." He saw the pride and hesitation in her eyes. "Keep it. You will need it for nails." His refusal was gentle but firm. It was not pity. It was a simple statement of fairness as he saw it. It chipped away at her reserve, making a small space for trust. The next morning, a rider approached. It was Silas Merrick. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of polite concern. "Heard the storm hit you hard." "Abigail," he said, his eyes sweeping over the patched barn. "The debris. It's a hard thing for anyone to manage, let alone—" He left the words unsaid. "We are managing, Mr. Merrick," Abigail said, her voice cool. Eli had been sorting salvageable lumber behind her. He came and stood a few feet behind her shoulder. Saying nothing, he was just a ragged drifter, but his presence was solid, a silent counterweight to Merrick's imposing frame. "I want you to know my offer still stands," Merrick continued, his tone like smooth oil. "I will take the land off your hands, pay the bank, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. No shame in it. This is my home. It is not for sale." Merrick's eyes flickered to Eli for a moment, a flicker of annoyance, before returning to her. "A home needs a strong roof. This is a big country. Abigail, it can swallow a person whole." He mounted his horse. As he turned to leave, Eli stepped forward and deliberately slid the heavy wooden bolt on the gate to her yard. The sound of it, a solid chunk of wood settling into place, was louder than any word that had been spoken. Merrick heard it. He glanced back, his jaw tight, before spurring his horse and riding away. Later that week, when Abigail went to town for supplies, the blow she had been dreading finally fell. The bank's official 60-day notice of intent to foreclose had arrived. Deputy Crane was standing on the porch of the general store. A small crowd gathered around him. He was holding the notice, and he was reading it aloud, his voice booming with false authority. Payment of interest in the amount of $52.40 is due within 60 days, or the property held as collateral, namely the Finch Ranch, will be subject to seizure. He was making a spectacle of her hardship, turning her private struggle into public entertainment. Faces in the crowd turned to her, some with pity, some with a kind of hungry curiosity. She felt her face burn with humiliation, but she lifted her chin and walked past them, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. That night, she made her decision. She found Eli in the barn, sharpening an old axe head with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a steady, calming sound. "I will hire you," she said without preamble. He stopped and looked at her. "For 6 weeks. That is how long the bank has given me. The pay will be a roof and meals. If I can sell the new calves before the deadline, I will pay you a wage, a fair one. But I can promise nothing. The food will be plain, and the work will be hard." Eli set the axe down. He wiped his hands on his trousers and met her gaze. His eyes were clear, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her, not just the work that needed to be done. 6 weeks, he said, his voice a low rumble. 6 weeks is long enough to build something that can stand against the wind. He started the next day on the fence line that Merrick's cattle had broken. He did not just replace the one leaning post. He dug a deep, new hole for the corner post, twice as deep as the old one. He set a thick, solid length of cedar into the earth, tamping the dirt around it until it was as solid as a rock. He found a can of pine tar in the barn and coated the base of the post, protecting it from rot and moisture. Then, he took out a small, sharp knife. With a few deft strokes, he carved a single clean letter into the wood, an F for Finch. It was a small act, but it felt like a declaration, a reclaiming of a border that had been violated. It was a statement written in wood and earth, claiming this small patch of the world as her own. From the saloon in town, Jeb Hollis saw Eli buying a small sack of nails at the general store. He watched the way Eli carried himself, the way he kept his back to the wall. He watched the worn mail pouch at his belt. Hollis had a long memory. He remembered a poster from a few years back. After a mail coach robbery up north, they had caught most of the gang, but one of the guards had vanished. The poster had not been for a wanted man, but for a witness. It offered a reward for information. The description had mentioned a tall, quiet man with a scar on his cheek and hands that knew their way around tools. Hollis took a long drink of his beer. The past, he knew, always paid one way or another. That evening, the cabin was quiet. The children had gone home, their lessons for the day done. Abigail sat at the big cottonwood desk, preparing the reading for the next day. Eli sat at the small kitchen table, cleaning a piece of horsetack. The silence between them was comfortable, the air filled with the smell of coffee and leather. To practice the lesson, she began to read aloud from the McGuffey reader, her voice soft in the lamplit room. It was a passage about perseverance. She stumbled on a word, indefatigable. She tried it twice, the syllables feeling clumsy in her mouth. From across the room, Eli spoke, his voice quiet so as not to startle her. Indefatigable. He broke it down, his own pronunciation slow and careful. It means tireless. She looked up, surprised. It was not just that he knew the word. It was the way he had said it, the patient, instructional tone. He was not just a man of strong back and skilled hands. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a depth she had not noticed before, a quiet intelligence that he kept shielded, like a lantern turned low. It was a small thing, a single word in a quiet room, but it was the first thread of a different kind of connection, a fragile string between two lonely souls in a valley of dust and wind. The 6 weeks began with a plan, by the light of a kerosene lamp. They sat at opposite ends of the massive cottonwood desk, a silent truce between his world and hers. Eli, with a piece of charcoal on a clean pine board, sketched. He was not an artist, but his lines were confident and clear. He drew a new barn, not the simple square the old one had been, but a U-shape, with the open end facing away from the prevailing wind. He sketched a small ditch, a careful diversion from the creek to a patch of ground that could serve as a garden, conserving the precious well water. Abigail, on her side, worked in the ledger. She calculated the dates her few cows were due to calve, the amount of feed she had left, and the number of tutoring hours she would need to afford basics like flour and salt. She divided the days, her neat script a counterpoint to his rough sketches. Mornings were for the children and their lessons. Afternoons were for the ranch. It was a partnership born of necessity, a business arrangement written in charcoal and ink. Nature tested their new alliance on the very first night. The wind died down to an unsettling stillness, and a new sound crept into the valley, the thin, hungry cry of a wolf, answered by another, and then another. The pack was close, drawn by the scent of her livestock. Abigail reached for the shotgun, but Eli stopped her with a quiet gesture. He went into the barn and returned with a handful of empty tin cans from her trash pile and a length of baling wire. He worked quickly in the moonlight, stringing the cans along the newly repaired fence line, creating a crude but effective alarm system. "It will not stop them," he said, his voice a low murmur in the dark, "but it will tell us when they are trying." They took turns on watch, sitting on the cabin porch with a shotgun laid across their laps. The night was long and cold, the darkness alive with imagined shapes. "Ever wonder what they are saying?" Abigail asked, breaking a long silence. Her voice was tight. Eli considered the question. Probably complaining about the accommodations, noisy neighbors, poor service. She let out a small, surprised laugh. "And the food?" "Tough and stringy," he said, a faint smile in his voice. "Hardly worth the walk." The humor, dry and unexpected, eased the tension in her shoulders. They were two small figures against a vast and predatory wilderness, and for a few moments, it felt a little less lonely. The wolves circled but did not attack, their howls a constant, unnerving chorus until the first gray light of dawn sent them slinking back into the hills. The next morning, the children arrived for their lessons. They were wary of Eli, who was replacing a rotted board on the porch. Young Sam, the boldest of the group, pointed a grubby finger. "My PA says you are a drifter." The word hung in the air, an accusation. Eli stopped hammering, his face unreadable. Before he could speak, Abigail stepped out of the cabin, a slate in her hand. "In bitter wash, Sam," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Anyone who does an honest day's work for an honest wage is a neighbor. Do you understand?" Sam looked from her stern face to Eli's quiet one and nodded, his cheeks flushing. The other children shuffled their feet, suitably chastened. Abigail had drawn a line in the dust, not just for the children, but for the whole town. Eli was under her protection. He picked up his hammer and drove a nail home with a single, powerful blow. Later that day, he turned his attention to the cracked water bucket. It was a symbol of her struggle, this vessel that could not hold what it was meant to. She watched as he worked, his movements precise. He did not try to patch the wood. Instead, he took an old horseshoe from the barn, heated it in the small forge until it glowed a dull red, and with his hammer, carefully flattened and shaped it into a thin, strong band. He cooled it, then worked it around the bucket's rim, using a few salvaged nails as rivets to pull the cracked staves together. He sealed the split with pine pitch. When he was done, he lowered it into the well and drew it up. He held it out for her to see. It was full to the brim, not a single drop leaking from the scarred wood. The old, broken thing was whole again, the ugly iron band a testament to its new strength. It could hold water now. It was a small miracle. His way with the children was another quiet surprise. He was teaching Sam how to hammer a nail into a piece of scrap wood. The boy's first few attempts were wild, bending the nails into useless shapes. "Do not fight it," Eli said patiently. "Just guide it." He took another nail. "See, a straight nail is easy to drive. A bent one." He tapped one of the boy's crooked attempts. "It is hard to drive, just like a rumor. Once it gets bent, it is hard to make it go where you want." The boy laughed, and the other children, who had been watching from a distance, crept a little closer, their fear of the quiet, scarred man beginning to melt away. Silas Merrick paid another visit a few days later. This time without Deputy Crane. He found Abigail near the creek. His tone was neighborly, his words laced with poison. "I was speaking with the man at the bank," he said conversationally. "He is a hard man, but fair. I told him you were a good woman in a tough spot." He paused, letting his supposed generosity sink in. "I might be able to persuade him to extend your note. All I would ask in return is a small consideration. Shared access to this creek. My herd gets awful thirsty on the summer drive." It was a clever trap. The creek was her lifeblood. Shared access meant his herd would drink it dry and trample the banks into a muddy wasteland. He was offering to save her from the bank by letting him bleed her dry himself. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Merrick," she said, her voice polite but icy. "But my water is not for sale." His smile thinned. "A pity," he said, and rode away. The first real crack in their fragile trust appeared the following week. Abigail was looking for a spare bit of canvas in the barn's loft and came across Eli's meager possessions tucked behind a stack of hay bales. There was his tool roll, a spare shirt, and a small, oilskin pouch. As she reached past it, her hand brushed against something hard and rectangular inside. Curious, she pulled it out. It was a thick envelope, heavy with what felt like folded paper, and sealed with a lump of dark red wax. It had no address, no name. It was old. The paper yellowed, but the seal was unbroken. She was holding it when he came up the ladder. He stopped dead, his eyes fixing on the envelope in her hand. His face, usually so calm, became a shuttered mask. He did not move, did not speak, but she felt a sudden chill in the warm, dusty air. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He came up the last few rungs of the ladder and gently took the envelope from her, his fingers barely brushing hers. He tucked it back into the pouch without a word. "Eli," she said, her throat tight, "I do not keep secrets here. My life is an open book. Whether I like it or not, I cannot afford to have secrets under my roof." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "Sometimes, Abigail," he said, his voice low and strained. "Secrets are the only roof a man has. They are what get you through the season." He left her then, climbing back down the ladder, leaving her alone in the loft with a dozen unanswered questions and the cold seed of suspicion planted in her heart. The outside world continued to press in. A team of railroad surveyors arrived, driving wooden stakes with bright red flags into the valley floor. They worked with an impersonal efficiency, their tripods and measuring chains a strange intrusion on the landscape. One of their stakes appeared not 50 yards from Abigail's newly carved fence post, a stark reminder that a line on a map in an office in Cheyenne could be more powerful than any fence she could build. The land might not be taken by Merrick, but by a force even bigger and more indifferent. The next day, Deputy Crane rode out, 2 of Merrick's ranch hands with him. He dismounted at her corner post, the one Eli had so carefully set. "This post is obstructing a public cattle trail," he announced, though no such trail had ever been designated there. With a grunt, he and the other men worked the post back and forth until they could pull it from the ground. They tossed it aside and rode off, leaving the hole gaping and the wires dangling uselessly. It was a petty, deliberate act of provocation. Abigail watched them go, her hands clenched into fists, a hot, helpless anger rising in her. She expected Eli to rage, to talk of riding into town for a confrontation. Instead, he watched them disappear, his face grim but calm. He said nothing all evening. But that night, long after she had gone to bed, she was woken by a faint, rhythmic thudding sound. She went to the window, in the pale moonlight. She saw Eli at the corner of the fence line. He had the post and was setting it back into the earth. He was not just putting it back in the hole. He was digging it deeper, using a heavy tamping rod to pack the earth around it until it was more solid than before. He worked for over an hour, a silent, solitary figure of defiance. He did not meet violence with violence, but with quiet, unshakable persistence. A few days later, the sky turned a bruised, yellowish color. A sudden, unseasonable hailstorm swept through the valley. The stones were the size of acorns, hitting the dry ground with a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers. They were caught out in the open, checking on a newborn calf. The barn Eli shouted over the roar. They ran, the hail stinging their faces and hands, and tumbled into the relative safety of the hayloft just as the full fury of the storm broke. The noise on the roof was deafening. They sat in the dim, sweet-smelling hay, leaning against the same bale, their shoulders almost touching. They were breathless, their clothes soaked. Outside, the world was being hammered and broken. But inside, there was a strange sense of peace, of shared sanctuary. Abigail shivered, a combination of cold and adrenaline. Eli reached into his coat and produced a small metal flask. He uncapped it and handed it to her. It was hot, strong coffee, sweetened with a little sugar. She took a grateful sip, the warmth spreading through her chest. She passed it back to him. They sat there in silence, sharing the coffee, listening to the storm rage outside. For the first time, she felt something other than just gratitude or suspicion toward the man beside her. She felt safe, leaning her back against the hay, feeling the solid presence of his shoulder near hers. Abigail Finch closed her eyes and, for a moment, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would get through this season after all. The fragile peace bought by the hailstorm did not last. The past arrived in Bitterwash not with a bang, but on the silent feet of Jeb Hollis. He took to spending his afternoons on the saloon porch, a spot that gave him a clear view of the road to and from the Finch ranch. Abigail would see him on her trips to the general store, his eyes following her wagon, his gaze lingering on Eli as he loaded sacks of feed. He was not threatening, not yet. He was watching, like a patient predator sizing up its prey. With Hollis's presence came the whispers. They started as idle gossip, old men remembering tales of the trail. The Black Creek mail robbery, 5 years back, a payroll gone, one guard killed, the other vanished. They said the gang had scattered, but that some of them were rumored to be drifting back through the territory, looking for an old score or a new one. The whispers were just stories, thin as smoke, but they seemed to cling to Eli. Men in the saloon would go quiet when he entered. He was the stranger, the drifter. It was easy to pin a story to a man with no history. Abigail heard the talk. She tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as the mean-spirited speculation of bored men. But the memory of the sealed envelope in Eli's pouch was a constant, nagging counterpoint to her faith in him. The two things, the whispers and the secret, began to weave together in her mind, creating a dark and troubling tapestry. The work on the ranch had become a steady rhythm that she had come to depend on. Eli had begun digging a new well in a patch of gravelly soil her father had always said was hopeless. He worked with a relentless, quiet energy, his shovel striking the rocky earth with a rhythmic scrape and thud. The sound was a comfort, a sign of progress. He often worked late, and she would sometimes see him from the cabin window, a solitary figure working by moonlight, during the day, while she taught the children their letters and sums. He would sometimes stand outside the open door for a few moments, listening. He never interrupted, never came inside. It was a gesture of profound respect for her space, for her world. When a leg on one of the children's benches came loose, he waited until the lessons were done for the day before he came in to fix it. He moved around the great cottonwood desk as if it were a sacred object, his tools never once touching its surface. He was mending her world, but he was careful not to trespass on her memories. His quiet competence, however, was becoming a topic of conversation among the townswomen. "That man of yours can fix anything," one of them said to Abigail at the store. "My husband says he has never seen a man so handy with an axe." The words, meant as a compliment, landed like a small stone in her shoe. He was not her man. He was her hired hand. And the admiration of other women sparked a feeling in her she was ashamed to admit. A hot, possessive flicker of irritation that was as confusing as it was unwelcome. The pressure of the banknote was a constant, dull ache. A man from the Cheyenne office rode out one afternoon with a new proposal. Seeing the progress on the ranch, the mended fences and the shored-up barn, the bank was willing to offer an alternative to foreclosure. A crop share contract. They would extend the loan, and in return, they would take a significant percentage of her calf sales and any future harvest for the next 5 years. It was a tempting offer, a release from the immediate 60-day threat. She showed the contract to Eli that evening. He read it slowly, his finger tracing the dense legal language. When he was done, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "It is a different kind of fence," he said. "They are offering to save you from the wolf by locking you in a pen with the butcher." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "Do not trade your future harvests for a moment of peace today. Abigail, you will be working for them for years to come." He was right. It was another trap, just a different kind from Merrick's. She tore the contract in half. The tension finally broke a few days later. The whispers in town had grown bolder, and Jeb Hollis had taken to riding a slow circuit on the road past her property. Abigail could not bear the silence, the not knowing, any longer. She found Eli by the new well, his shirt soaked with sweat, his arms caked with mud. The hole was nearly 10 feet deep, and so far, all he had found was more rock. "The men in town are talking," she said, her voice strained. "They are talking about a mail robbery, about a missing guard." He stopped digging. He leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily, not looking at her. "Talk is cheap. This talk has a price, and I am the one paying it," she retorted, her frustration boiling over. "They look at you, and then they look at me. Jeb Hollis watches this ranch like a hawk. What is in that envelope?" "Eli." He finally looked at her, his face a mixture of weariness and regret. He wiped a muddy hand across his brow. "I was on the back of a ride that did not end well," he said, his voice flat. It was the Black Creek Run. The confession, when it came, was simple and stark. He had been a guard, yes, but he had not been a hero. When the robbers hit, his partner had been shot. In the chaos and the gunfire, Eli had grabbed the registered mail pouch and run. He had not fired a shot. He had escaped into the woods, leaving his partner behind. The envelope was from that pouch. It contained affidavits and a signed confession from a clerk who was part of the gang, detailing a conspiracy that went higher up in the postal service. Eli had run to save the evidence, he said, but he knew he had also run to save himself. Abigail's mind reeled. He was not a robber, but he had run. He had abandoned his post, his partner. The story fit the man, his quiet nature, his desire to be unseen. But it was not a story of a hero. It was a story of a survivor, and she did not know if she could trust one. "I cannot live with this doubt," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I cannot have my name, my father's name, tied to a man who is running from the law." "I am not running from the law," he said, his voice raw. I am running from the men the law could not touch." "Then prove it." The words were out before she could stop them. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was the only way. "The circuit judge is due in Bitter Wash tomorrow. In the morning, you will take that envelope and give it to him, and I will be there to watch you do it." It was an ultimatum. She was asking him to dredge up a past he had clearly tried to bury, to make himself a target. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the hunted look she had seen the day he arrived. She fully expected him to refuse, to pack his meager belongings and disappear into the dusk. The next morning, for the first time since he had arrived, he cleaned himself up before starting work. He heated water on the stove and shaved, the long, rough beard giving way to a strong jaw and a firm mouth. The scar on his cheek was more prominent now, a pale line against his weathered skin. When the children saw him, Sam wrinkled his nose. "You look different," the boy declared. "Less like a bear." Eli looked down at the boy, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Crinkling the corners of his eyes, he let out a low, theatrical grrr, and then chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound she had never heard before. The children giggled, their last remnants of fear of the big, quiet man finally dissolving. The world pressed in again that afternoon. Silas Merrick had organized a large community picnic and bull riding contest, ostensibly to raise funds for the coming railroad. The whole valley turned out. Merrick was in his element, playing the generous benefactor, shaking hands and buying rounds of lemonade. At the height of the festivities, he stood on a wagon bed and made a speech, his voice carrying over the crowd. He spoke of progress and the future, and then his eyes found Abigail, who was standing at the edge of the crowd with the children. "Progress requires vision," Merrick boomed. "It requires making hard choices. Some of the old ways must make way for the new. Some small holdings must be consolidated for the greater good." He smiled, a wide, predatory grin. "It is a simple choice. Folks, sell, or be swallowed." The threat was naked, public. He was daring her, daring the whole town to stand against him. Eli had refused to come. He spent the day at the bottom of the well, digging. When Abigail returned, shaken and angry, she found him sitting by the hole, covered in dirt. A small trickle of muddy water was seeping into the bottom of the well. It was not much, but it was a start. That night, after she had put her fears and Merrick's threats away in the ledger, she went to the small tool shed. She took the heavy iron key from its hook. She found Eli in the barn, mending a piece of harness by lantern light. She held the key out to him. It lay heavy and cold in her palm. "This is for the tool shed," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "You have earned the right not to have to ask for what you need to do your work." He looked at the key, then at her face, understanding the magnitude of the gesture. She was giving him her trust, a solid, tangible piece of it. She was making her choice, not because of what a judge might say tomorrow, but because of what he had done for the last several weeks. She closed his fingers around the key. "If you decide to leave," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "just be sure to lock it behind you. I still have to teach class in the morning." She turned and walked back to the cabin, not looking back, leaving him alone in the lantern light with the key and the choice in his hand. He was waiting for her on the porch the next morning, the key to the tool shed, not in the lock, but on the nail beside the door where she had always kept it. He had the oilskin pouch in his hand. The sun was just clearing the eastern bluffs, casting long, cool shadows across the yard. "The judge is not in Bitter Wash," he said before she could ask. "He is due back on the circuit in 2 days. I will meet him then." It was not a question or a negotiation. It was a statement of intent. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that her act of trust with the key had been answered. He would face his past, not just for himself, but for her. The reprieve, this small bubble of 2 days, changed the air between them. The unspoken tension of the ultimatum was gone, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The work took on a new urgency, a new meaning. It was no longer about just surviving the next 60 days. It was about building something that would last longer. The story of their strange arrangement was the primary currency of gossip in Bitterwash. That afternoon, when Abigail went to the general store, she felt the weight of curious eyes. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her vinegar was sour, was holding court by the pickle barrel. "It is a scandal, is what it is," she declared to a small audience of women. "A lone woman taking in a ragged drifter like that. Lord knows what he is after." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was perfectly audible across the small store. She took in a ragged drifter, and now he is building her a ranch and a life she never dreamed of. The last words were laced with a heavy, mocking irony, implying a life of shame and ruin. The other women clucked in agreement. Abigail paid for her flour, her face a calm, unreadable mask, and walked out without a word. The phrase, however, followed her home. A burr stuck to her thoughts, a life she never dreamed of. Mrs. Gable meant it as an insult. Abigail was beginning to wonder if it might be a prophecy. The proof of it was rising from the dust of her yard. Eli was building the new barn, and it was a masterpiece of frugal ingenuity. He laid out the U-shaped foundation, a design that would create a sheltered corral, protected from the winter winds. The lumber came from the old, ruined barn, every soundboard salvaged, every nail straightened and reused. For the new posts, he bartered a day of his labor mending the blacksmith's roof in exchange for 6 solid cedar logs. He used strips of old canvas from a broken wagon cover to seal the joints. For the water trough, he took the inner tubes from 2 discarded wagon wheels, sealed the ends, and laid them in a wooden frame, a long, black waterproof basin that wasted nothing. The roof was made of hand-split cedar shakes, each one carefully overlapped, a tight, beautiful pattern that would shed rain and snow for a generation. The structure rose from the ground, solid and true, a physical manifestation of his promise. It was not just a barn, it was a fortress against the hardships of the valley. One afternoon, while he was fitting the heavy crossbeam over the main entrance, his hand slipped. A long, wicked splinter of green wood drove deep into the palm of his hand. He swore a low, sharp curse and pulled it out, but the cut was deep and bled freely. Abigail saw it from the porch. She went inside and came back with a clean cloth, a bowl of hot water, and a bottle of carbolic. She said nothing, simply took his large, calloused hand in hers. Her touch was gentle but firm. He stood perfectly still, watching her as she carefully cleaned the wound, her brow furrowed in concentration. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, the smell of soap and pine and the faint, coppery scent of his blood. Her fingers were deft and sure. His hand, which could split a log with a single blow, was utterly pliant in hers. When the wound was clean, she wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean linen. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She looked up, and their eyes met. His gaze was direct, stripped of all his usual reserve. It held a warmth and a gratitude that went far beyond the simple tending of a wound. She felt a blush rise in her cheeks and quickly looked down. Tying off the bandage, the moment passed, but the memory of it lingered, the feeling of his hand in hers, the unexpected intimacy of her care for him. Later, as they stood looking at the nearly completed barn, he spoke of the future as if it were a given. "That patch of ground by the creek," he said, pointing, "the soil is good. We could put in a few plum trees, and along the fence line, we could plant willows. They grow fast. In a few years, they would make a living fence, a good windbreak. It would give the children a shady place to wait for the school bell." He spoke of we, and in a few years with such simple certainty that it took her breath away. He was not just working for a wage. He was planting roots, not just for himself, but for her, for the children. He was weaving his future into the fabric of her land. At the railroad fundraiser that weekend, Silas Merrick saw them arrive together. He watched them from the wagon bed he used as a stage, his eyes cold as Abigail passed with a plate of cornbread. He leaned down, his voice dripping with condescension. "Quite the little castle you are building out there, Abigail, fashioned from the bones of a hired hand." Abigail stopped and looked up at him, her expression unblinking. "These bones are ours, Mr. Merrick," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "and they are not for sale." She walked away, leaving him with a tight, angry line for a mouth. The highlight of the festival was the bull riding. It was mostly for show. Young ranch hands trying to prove their mettle on half-wild steers. Eli, his hand bandaged, stood with her watching. One of the organizers, full of drink and good cheer, called out to him, "Hey, Cutter, you are a strong-looking fellow. Why not try your luck? A silver dollar for 8 seconds." The crowd cheered. Eli looked uncomfortable. "I am a carpenter, not a cowboy," he said. But the crowd egged him on, and with a slight, resigned shrug at Abigail, he climbed the fence. The steer was a rangy, ill-tempered creature. Eli settled onto its back, and the gate flew open. For a moment, he actually seemed to be riding it, his body moving with the animal's violent bucking. Then, with a comical yelp, he was thrown, landing in a heap in the soft dust. The crowd roared with laughter. He stood up, dusting himself off, a sheepish grin on his face. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a single, large nail that had worked its way through the fabric. "Forgot about that," he said to the men who helped him up. He bowed dramatically to the steer, which was now glaring at him from across the arena. "The carpenter rides the bull," he announced to the laughing crowd. "The bull wins." It was a moment of pure, unpretentious humility. He was not a man driven by false pride. He could laugh at himself, and in that moment, the town laughed with him, not at him. That night marked a turning point. The ledger and the charcoal sketches lay on the kitchen table. It was time to plan the next phase of the work. "Bring your board to the desk," Abigail said quietly. "There is more light there." It was more than an invitation. The cottonwood desk was her father's legacy, the seat of her authority, the symbol of her solitary struggle. Sharing it was like sharing a part of herself. He brought the pine board over, and, for the first time, they worked side by side at the great desk, her neat columns of figures next to his strong, practical drawings. The lamplight fell on both of them, a circle of shared endeavor. He pointed to a spot on his sketch. "When the new well finally gives clear water," he said, his voice a low promise, "I will plant those plum trees for you." She looked from his drawing to her ledger. "And when the wind can get through a winter without tearing at that roof," she replied, her own promise meeting his. "I will add an extra hour of lessons for the children each day." Their small, interlocking vows hung in the quiet air of the cabin, a foundation stronger than any wood or stone. The town's perception began to shift. The gossip did not stop, but its tone changed. The mocking irony in Mrs. Gable's voice was replaced by a grudging respect. The children, who now followed Eli around like a flock of small birds, started calling him Uncle Eli. One afternoon, as he was fixing the cabin door, young Sam brought him a McGuffey reader. "Can you read this part to us, Uncle Eli?" he asked. "Miss Abigail says it is about a brave knight." Eli took the book, a faint flush on his cheeks. He sat on the porch step. The children gathered at his feet and began to read. His voice was slow, and he stumbled over the longer words, but he read with a steady, earnest cadence. The children were rapt. When he finished, they clapped their hands. He looked over their heads and saw Abigail standing in the doorway, a soft, true smile on her face. Later that evening, after the children had gone, he took his knife and went to the new barn. He climbed a ladder to the great crossbeam that spanned the entrance, and there, in the center of the beam, he began to carve. He worked for an hour in the fading light, the blade of his knife sure and steady. When he was done, he had carved a small, detailed bird into the wood, a finch, its wings outstretched, as if it were taking flight or coming home to roost. He had signed his work. He had put his mark on their home. The night of the judge's expected arrival was unnaturally still, the air holding its breath. The silence was broken not by the wind, but by a flicker of orange in the darkness, a hungry color that did not belong in the landscape of moonlight and shadow. Eli saw it first from the barn, a strange, dancing light near the hayrick. Then came the smell, the acrid bite of burning grass and dry wood. He was shouting before he was fully out the door, his voice a raw alarm that sliced through the night. Fire. Abigail was already on the porch, her face pale in the sudden, terrible light. The hayrick, their entire winter's feed for the animals, was engulfed in a column of roaring flame. Sparks rained down, and the fire was spreading with terrifying speed toward the small shed where she stored her grain. Chaos erupted. The milk cow bellowed in fear, her calf huddled beside her. Eli did not hesitate. He plunged into the newly built barn, his silhouette framed for a moment against the inferno, and emerged a second later, driving the panicked horses out into the open pasture, away from the danger. Then he turned back, grabbing a heavy blanket. The calf, he yelled to her, "Keep it away from the flames!" He ran toward the small shed, beating at the embers that had landed on its roof. Abigail, her mind finally catching up to the horror, acted on pure instinct. She grabbed the first thing she could think of, the mended water bucket. She ran to the trough, filled it, and threw the contents at the spreading ground fire. The water hissed into steam, a pathetic defense against the blaze. But it was something. It was an action. She fell into a frantic, desperate rhythm. Run to the trough, fill the bucket, run to the fire, throw, run back! The iron band Eli had forged held the old wood together, allowing her to carry a full measure of water each time. The old, repaired thing was her only weapon. Eli had beaten out the sparks on the shed roof and was now trying to wrestle the terrified calf away from its mother and the encroaching flames. The calf, wild with fear, fought him. Just then, a section of the burning hayrick collapsed inward, sending a shower of fiery debris into the sky. A burning timber landed squarely on the shed roof. In seconds, the dry wood caught. Eli, she screamed. He abandoned the calf and charged the shed. Throwing his shoulder against the door, it burst open, and he disappeared into the smoke. For a heart-stopping moment, he was gone. Then he stumbled back out, dragging 2 heavy sacks of grain, his face black with soot, his hair singed. He dropped them and went back in. Again and again, saving what he could before the roof gave way with a groaning crash. They worked until the hayrick was a smoldering ruin and the shed was a blackened skeleton. The main barn, their triumph, was safe. The animals were safe, but their winter supply of feed was gone. As the adrenaline faded, a cold, grim exhaustion set in. They stood side by side, breathing in the smoky air, looking at the destruction. By the first light of dawn, Eli circled the perimeter of the burnt area. He stopped, pointing to the soft earth near the fence. There, pressed clearly into the dirt, were the footprints of a single rider. And in one of the prints, the distinctive mark of a boot with a worn heel. Deputy Crane arrived an hour later, Silas Merrick riding beside him. Crane surveyed the scene with a look of theatrical sympathy. "Terrible business," he said, shaking his head. "You must have left a lantern out." "Abigail, it happens. A moment of carelessness is all it takes." "It was not a lantern," Eli said, his voice low and hard. He pointed to the tracks. "Someone was here." Crane glanced at the footprints and shrugged. "A drifter, probably. You get them this time of year. No way to prove anything." He dismissed the evidence with a wave of his hand. Merrick stepped forward, his expression full of concern. "This is a terrible blow. Abigail," he said softly, "you cannot possibly recover before winter. I am a reasonable man. Let me help you. I will give you a fair price for the land, enough to set you up somewhere new, somewhere safer." Abigail looked at the smoldering pile that had been her security, then at Merrick's predatory face. She felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her knees. But then she saw the silent, burning fury in Eli's eyes. It was a mirror of her own, and it gave her strength. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "I am not selling." The truth exploded in the saloon that afternoon. Eli had ridden into town to see if the judge had arrived. He was standing at the bar when Jeb Hollis walked in. Hollis was not watching from a distance anymore. He walked directly to Eli, a rolled-up piece of paper in his hand. "Cutter," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I have been looking for you for a long time." He unrolled the paper and slapped it down on the bar. It was a 5-year-old reward poster. The ink faded, the paper yellowed. It offered $500 for information leading to the whereabouts of Eli Cutter, sole surviving witness to the Black Creek mail robbery. A hush fell over the room. Hollis let the silence build before he spoke again. "They never found the mastermind of that robbery," he said, his eyes glinting. "The one who gave the gang the schedule and the payroll information, the one who was supposed to make sure the guards were looking the other way." He paused, then pointed a long finger at Deputy Crane, who was sitting at Merrick's table, his face suddenly pale. "Turns out a deputy postmaster from up north fits the description. A man who resigned his post right after the robbery and drifted south, ending up with a nice, quiet job in a town like this." Crane shot to his feet, his hand going to his pistol. "That is a lie slander." "Is it?" Hollis said smoothly. "Because this man, Cutter, he ran off with the evidence, a sealed envelope with sworn statements that would have put you away for 20 years. And I hear," his gaze swept the room, "that he still has it." The room erupted in a babble of voices. Eli stood motionless, the eye of the storm. He looked at Crane, whose bluster was already failing, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Then he looked past him, at Silas Merrick, who sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. Eli understood then. The fire. Merrick and Crane were trying to burn Abigail out, to force her to sell before the judge arrived, before the truth could come out. He walked out of the saloon, leaving the chaos behind him. He rode back to the ranch, his mind a storm of conflict. He could ride away now, disappear again, just like he had 5 years ago. Let Crane and Merrick have the valley. Or he could stay and fight. He could unearth a past that would put a target on his back. That could get him killed. But if he ran, Abigail would lose everything. He had promised her 6 weeks. He had carved her family's initial into her land. He had made a silent vow. He found her by the well, her face grim. She had already heard the news. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "All of it," he said. He looked at the ruin of the shed, at the new barn that stood as a testament to their work, at her tired, defiant face. His choice was clear. "The judge is in Rock Creek, a day's ride from here. I am leaving now." The journey was a battle against a world that seemed determined to stop him. The sky opened up, a cold, sleeting rain that turned the mountain roads into a treacherous river of mud. The old wagon he had borrowed from a neighbor groaned under the strain. Halfway up the pass, there was a sharp crack, and the wagon lurched violently. A rear wheel had split, the wood rotten and weak. He was stranded. He did not waste a moment. He took the oilskin pouch with the precious envelope, wrapped it in his coat to keep it dry, and started walking. The rain turned to ice, stinging his face. The mud pulled at his boots with every step, a cold, heavy hand. He was no longer just a man on a road. He was a force of will against the raw, indifferent power of nature. He was nearing a narrow wooden bridge that spanned a deep ravine when a figure stepped out from behind a rock. Jeb Hollis. He held a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. "The reward is for information." "Cutter," Hollis said, his voice flat. "But Merrick pays better for silence. Give me the envelope." "Get out of my way." "Hollis," Eli said, his hand closing around the carpenter's hammer tucked into his belt. Hollis lunged. Eli sidestepped, the knife slicing through the air where he had been. He swung the heavy hammer, not to strike, but to defend, catching Hollis's knife hand on the backswing. The knife clattered to the bridge planks. The fight was brutal and clumsy. Two exhausted men slipping on the icy wood. Hollis was faster, but Eli was stronger. He drove Hollis back against the railing. But the bounty hunter was wiry and desperate. He pulled a second, smaller knife from his boot and slashed wildly. The blade caught Eli high on the shoulder. A searing, white-hot line of pain. Eli grunted, staggered back, then brought the hammer down in a short, powerful arc, striking Hollis on the side of the head. Hollis crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Eli stood over him, breathing heavily, the rain washing the blood from the gash in his shoulder down his arm. He picked up the envelope, and without a backward glance, continued his journey. Back at the ranch, Abigail was preparing for her own battle. With Eli gone, she felt a profound and terrifying vulnerability. The children arrived for their lessons, their faces full of fear and questions. She gathered them around her. "We are going to be brave today," she told them, her own heart hammering against her ribs. They spent the morning not on lessons, but on defense. She and the children restrung the tin can alarms along the entire perimeter of the yard. They placed a cowbell on the gate. It was a pitiful defense, but it was all they had. When they were done, she took her father's old shotgun from its pegs on the wall. She sat on the porch, the gun across her lap. Her small flock of students huddled behind her. Her hands were shaking, but her grip on the gun was firm. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a guardian, a sentinel, defending her small patch of civilization against the encroaching darkness. Eli arrived at the judge's temporary courtroom in Rock Creek just as the court was preparing to adjourn for the day. He was a terrifying sight, covered in mud, his face pale with exhaustion, his left arm soaked in blood. He walked directly to the judge's bench and placed the oilskin pouch on the table. "This is evidence in the Black Creek mail robbery, Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy, "and it implicates Deputy Samuel Crane of Bitter Wash." The judge, a stern man with intelligent eyes, opened the pouch and broke the 5-year-old seal. He read the documents in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each page. When he was done, he looked at Eli. "You have put yourself in considerable danger by bringing this forward, Mr. Cutter." He then turned to his clerk. "Issue a summons for Deputy Crane, and issue an immediate order of protection for the property of one Abigail Finch. There will be no foreclosure, no seizure, and no sale of that land until this matter is fully investigated." When the news reached Bitter Wash, it split the town in two. Merrick's supporters scoffed, calling it the desperate act of a wanted man. But others, the ones who had seen Eli's steady work, the ones who had watched him laugh with their children, began to wonder. When Eli rode back into town late the next day, limping, his arm in a crude sling, but with his head held high, they saw not a fugitive, but a man who had faced down his past and won. He found Abigail on the porch, still on watch. Relief so powerful it was like a physical blow washed over her when she saw him. She helped him down from his horse and into the cabin. By the warm light of the lamp, she saw the full extent of his injury. The cut was long and deep, a ragged gash that needed stitching. She sterilized a needle and thread in the lamp's flame. He sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She worked in silence, her stitches small and neat. He bore the pain without a sound, but she could feel the tension in his shoulders, the tremors of exhaustion and relief that ran through him. When she was done, she stood before him, the needle and thread still in her hand. He looked up at her, his face etched with pain and gratitude. Slowly, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. He was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. She could feel his breath on her cheek, warm and alive. He was a man pushed to his absolute limit, stripped of all his defenses, and in that moment, he was trusting her with his vulnerability. "Thank you," he whispered, the words a raw sound in the quiet room, "for believing in me." She did not answer with words. She lifted her head slightly and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something deeper. It was slow and short and clean. It tasted of rain and dust and blood and coffee. It was the taste of survival. It was a thank you and a promise and a quiet recognition that their separate struggles had finally become one. The town hearing was held not in a courtroom, but in the saloon, the only building in Bitterwash large enough to hold the entire community. The circuit judge, a man named Hargrove with a face like carved granite and eyes that missed nothing, sat behind a hastily cleared poker table. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sawdust, and nervous sweat. Deputy Crane stood before the judge, his face puffy and slick with perspiration. He denied everything, his voice a mixture of bluster and panic. He was a respected officer of the law. He claimed Cutter was a drifter, a coward who had abandoned his post. This was nothing more than a desperate attempt to shift blame. Silas Merrick sat in the front row, a high-priced lawyer from Cheyenne at his side. The lawyer was a smooth, well-dressed man who looked profoundly out of place, and he periodically whispered into Merrick's ear. When Eli was called to testify, a murmur went through the crowd. He walked to the front of the room, his left arm still in its sling, his movements stiff. He did not look at Crane or Merrick. He looked only at the judge. His voice was low and steady, without anger or embellishment. He told the story of the Black Creek robbery, sticking to the facts he had seen. He described the ambush, the death of his partner, and his own escape with the mail pouch. Merrick's lawyer rose for his cross-examination. His voice was condescending, his questions designed to paint Eli as an unreliable, self-serving fugitive. "Mr. Cutter, is it not true that you deserted your post while your partner lay dying?" "I took the registered mail pouch and I ran," Eli said, his voice unchanging. "The pouch was my responsibility." "A responsibility you conveniently forgot for 5 years," the lawyer sneered. "I was afraid," Eli said, the admission costing him a visible effort, but I kept the evidence. Judge Hargrove leaned forward. "Let us see this evidence." The clerk produced the sealed envelope and the contents within. He also produced the postmaster's logbook from the Black Creek station, which had been sent for, the lawyer scoffed, calling the documents the uncorroborated ramblings of a known criminal. But the clerk pointed out a small, crucial detail. The wax seal on the envelope, pressed with the official Black Creek stamp, was slightly misaligned, a corner of it flattened. The logbook from that year noted that the station's stamp had been damaged and produced a similarly flawed impression for nearly 3 months. It was a small, perfect imperfection, a fingerprint of the truth. Then the judge produced a small cloth bag. After the robbery, the Army recovered several spent cartridges from the scene. They also recovered the service revolver of the deceased guard. But they found one shell casing that matched neither his weapon nor any of the robbers they later captured. He emptied the bag onto the table, a single, tarnished brass casing rolled to a stop. "The ballistics report notes it came from a Colt Peacemaker, same as the one on your hip. Deputy Crane, I have taken the liberty of sending for it." Crane's face went from pale to ashen. The room was utterly silent. He looked at Merrick, his eyes pleading. Merrick gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. It was over. In that moment, Crane broke. He bolted from his chair, shoving people aside, making a desperate run for the door. 2 men from the crowd, farmers who had long resented Crane's bullying, tackled him before he made it 3 steps. As Crane was being subdued, Merrick stood up, his face a cold mask of fury. His lawyer tried to restrain him, but Merrick shook him off. He pointed a finger at the struggling deputy. This was his doing. His greed, I merely saw an opportunity to acquire land that was being mismanaged. He was supposed to clear the way legally, through the bank. The confession, arrogant and self-serving, sealed his fate. Judge Hargrove's voice was like the crack of a whip. "Samuel Crane, you are under arrest for conspiracy, robbery, and murder. Silas Merrick, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and destruction of private property. Take them away." The hearing was over, but Merrick was not a man to be defeated by a gavel. While the town was still buzzing, he, his lawyer, and two of his most loyal ranch hands rode out of town, not toward Cheyenne, but toward Abigail's ranch. They found her and Eli by the new well. The fight, when it came, was not one of guns. It was a raw, elemental struggle over land and water. "This is not over," Merrick snarled. "Dismounting! The law can have the paperwork. I will have the land." He and his men advanced toward the well, crowbars in their hands. "You have cost me a fortune. Now I am going to cost you your future. You will not get a drop of water from this well." Eli stepped in front of Abigail, the carpenter's hammer hanging from his belt, his good hand resting near it. "You are not touching this well, Merrick." The wind, which had been rising all afternoon, gusted violently, whipping dust into the air. Eli saw a large canvas tarp, used to cover the salvaged lumber, lying nearby. An idea sparked. "Abigail, the cans," he yelled. One of Merrick's men lunged, and Eli met him, blocking the crowbar with his forearm. At the same moment, Abigail ran to the fence line and began to shake the wire with all her might. The tin cans clattered and banged, a sudden, jarring cacophony. Merrick's horse, already skittish from the wind, reared in terror, its eyes rolling. It crashed backward into the other ranch hand, who was just pulling his pistol. The man was knocked off his feet, his gun flying into the dirt. As Merrick turned toward the noise, distracted, Eli grabbed the canvas tarp with a powerful heave. He threw it into the wind. The canvas billowed out like a massive sail, a sudden, blinding wall of white that engulfed Merrick, whipping around his head and shoulders. He staggered back, disoriented, clawing at the heavy fabric. It was the opening Eli needed. He moved past the first man and faced Merrick, who had finally untangled himself from the tarp. Merrick roared in rage and swung his crowbar. Eli deflected the blow with his hammer, the clang of metal on metal ringing through the air. The force of the blow numbed his arm, but he held his ground. Merrick swung again, a wild, desperate arc. Eli ducked under it, stepped inside, and drove his shoulder hard into Merrick's chest. The bigger man stumbled backward, his feet tangling, and fell heavily to the ground. Eli stood over him, the hammer raised in his good hand. For a single, stretched-out second, everything hung in the balance. Merrick lay helpless at his feet, his face a mask of shock and rage. All the frustration, all the fear, all the injustice of the past weeks coalesced into this one moment. He could end it. He could bring the hammer down and silence the threat of Silas Merrick forever. He saw the flicker of fear in Merrick's eyes, and in that flicker, he saw a reflection of his own past, of the man who ran, the man who let violence dictate his choices. His knuckles were white on the handle of the hammer. His arm trembled with the effort of holding back. Then, with a shuddering breath, he lowered the hammer. He turned, grabbed a length of rope from a fence post, and with a few deft, angry knots, tied Merrick's hands behind his back. "Justice," he said, his voice a low growl, "belongs to the court." He had won the fight not with a final blow, but with a final act of restraint. He had defeated not just Merrick, but the part of himself that he had been running from for 5 years. When the judge's men arrived, they found Merrick and his hands tied up, Abigail holding the recovered pistol, and Eli standing guard, his hammer back in its loop. The judge formally confirmed Abigail's property lines and the dismissal of the bank's foreclosure notice. The war for Bitterwash was over. The aftermath was a quiet revolution. Several townspeople came out to the ranch over the next few days, their faces sheepish, offering apologies and help. The children arrived one morning not for lessons, but with a basket of warm corn muffins, a celebratory gift. To celebrate that the teacher's well still has water, young Sam announced proudly. The well itself seemed to participate in the victory. The digging and the recent rains had stirred up the mud and silt, but now, as the water settled, it began to run clear. Eli stood beside it, watching the clean water trickle in. He took a single, worn coin from his pocket, a token he had carried for years. He held it for a moment, then let it fall. It flashed once in the sunlight before disappearing into the clear water with a soft plink. He was letting the past sink, letting it find its own level at the bottom of things. That evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden light over their wounded but peaceful valley, he found Abigail on the porch. The silence between them was heavy with all the things that had happened and all the things that remained unsaid. "I should go," he said, his voice quiet. He would not look at her. "My past is ragged enough to tear a hole in your future. Abigail, you have earned your peace. You do not need my ghosts." She was silent for a long moment. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the weariness in his eyes, the fine lines of pain around his mouth. She reached out and touched his good hand, the one that had built her a barn and fought for her home. "Eli," she said, her voice soft but sure, her fingers lacing through his. "Our future needs these hands." His ghosts did not leave, but they grew quiet. The future she had offered him took the shape of lumber and earth, of small tasks that filled the days and pushed the shadows back. With the immediate threat gone, the rhythm of their life shifted from the frantic beat of survival to the steady, reassuring pace of construction. They were no longer just holding on. They were building. The school was the first sign of this new season. The one-room cabin had always been a little dark, a little cramped. Eli, with his good arm now healing, built a porch onto the front of it, a wide, shady space where the children could sit and eat their lunch out of the harsh sun. He used the last of the good cedar to frame Abigail's blackboard, giving it a place of honor, transforming it from a simple teaching tool into the centerpiece of the room. His most delicate work was done in the afternoons. After the children had gone home, he took each of their small, rough-hewn benches and, with the fine tip of his knife, carved the name of a child into the side of the seat. Sam, Mary, Thomas, each one had their own place now, a small, permanent declaration that they belonged. The ranch itself began to breathe again. The willow cuttings they had planted along the fence line, which had been just bare sticks, sprouted a fuzz of pale green leaves. They had taken root. The U-shaped barn stood against the ceaseless wind, its sheltered corral a haven of calm. And one morning, keeping the promise he had made across the cottonwood desk, Eli rode to a neighboring valley and returned with 3 small, spindly saplings, their roots wrapped carefully in damp burlap. They planted the plum trees together, digging the holes in the rich soil by the creek, their hands brushing as they firmed the earth around the fragile trunks. Their promises were becoming real, tangible things, growing from the ground they had fought so hard to keep. The small cabin, once a fortress for a solitary woman, now felt like a home. It filled with sounds that had been absent before, the low murmur of their conversation in the evenings, the scrape of Eli's chair as he leaned back from the table, and sometimes the sound of laughter. One evening, Abigail was helping him with his reading, using the McGuffey's reader as their text. The word was plum. He sounded it out slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Pa-la-um," he said, the sound coming out long and strange. "Plume." Young Sam, who was drawing on a slate by the fire, giggled. "It is not plume, Uncle Eli, it is plum." Eli tried again, but the sound came out the same way. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unself-conscious grin. He looked at Abigail, who was pressing her lips together to keep from laughing, and he chuckled. The sound was deep and easy, a sound of a man who was no longer afraid of his own imperfections. He laughed with them, and the small room felt warmer, brighter. The healing of the ranch was mirrored by the healing of the town. After the hearing, a delegation of 3 farmers had ridden out to the ranch, their hats in their hands. They had been Merrick's men, swayed by his power and his promises. Now, they were just neighbors, humbled and apologetic. They offered to help rebuild. Their offer sparked an idea in Abigail. Water, the lack of it, was a constant threat to them all. She proposed that instead of just helping her, they build something for everyone. A community cistern, dug deep and lined with stone, to catch the spring rains and hold them against the dry summer. The project took hold. Men who had been on opposite sides of the valley's conflict now worked shoulder to shoulder, digging, hauling stone, and sharing water from the same dipper. Eli, his shoulder now strong enough for heavy work, directed the construction with his quiet expertise. Abigail organized the women, who brought food and drink for the work crews. She sat at her father's cottonwood desk and, on a clean sheet of paper with her best ink, wrote a letter of thanks to the community, her handwriting clear and steady. The desk was no longer just a place for ledgers of debt and fear. It was a place for gratitude. Their partnership found its own easy balance. Abigail was the head, managing the school, the household accounts, and the careful planning of their resources. Eli was the hands, managing the never-ending cycle of mending and building, the care of the animals, the physical labor of the ranch. But on Sundays, their day of rest, they often traded roles. Eli would gather the children on the new porch and teach them how to build small, clumsy bird houses. His patient instructions a different kind of lesson. Abigail, in turn, would walk the property with the ledger, taking inventory of the lumber pile. Her practical mind learning the language of board feet and tensile strength. They were equals, their separate skills weaving together to create a whole stronger than its parts. One afternoon, Abigail took down the mended water bucket from its hook by the well. It had been replaced by a new, sound bucket, but she had not been able to bring herself to throw the old one away. She carried it to the porch and hung it from a hook beside the door, its ugly iron band and scarred wood in plain view. "What is that for?" Eli asked. "A reminder," she said softly, "that sometimes the broken things are the ones that save us." It was an acknowledgement of her own past, of the cracks in her life that had, in the end, let the light in. It was gratitude for the scars. Eli began to speak to the children about his past, not in hushed, ashamed tones, but as a story with a lesson. He told them about riding guard on the mail coach, about the dust and the long hours. He told them about the robbery, leaving out the worst of the violence, but not the truth of his own fear. "I was not a hero that day," he told the small, attentive group. "I ran, but I saved the truth, and in the end, I brought it back." He looked at their faces, wanting them to understand. A person cannot be a hero every single day, but you can try to be an honest person on the day it counts the most. Their newfound peace faced a new kind of test when the railroad surveyors returned. The main line was plotted, but now they were mapping potential spurs. A rumor flew through town that one such spur was being considered that would cut directly across Abigail's land, right through the new plum grove. The old Abigail would have met this threat with solitary, angry defiance. The old Eli might have met it with his fists. Instead, they met it together. They spent an evening at the cottonwood desk, poring over her father's old property deeds and maps. The next day, they rode to the surveyor's camp. They did not make threats or demands. They unrolled their maps and made their case with logic and reason, showing how a small adjustment to the route would save the railroad the trouble of crossing the creek twice and spare her orchard. The chief surveyor, a reasonable man, listened, studied his own charts, and agreed. It was a victory won not with violence, but with foresight and cooperation. During the discussion, Eli had made a small, friendly wager with one of the surveyors about the depth of the bedrock. Eli had won, and his prize was a single, perfectly machined brass nail, bright and shiny, unlike the roughed or hand-forged nails they used on the ranch. He tucked it carefully into his vest pocket, a small, golden trophy of a battle won with wits instead of muscle. That victory gave Abigail a new confidence. At the next town meeting, a debate arose about creating a volunteer fire brigade, a direct result of the fire at her ranch. When the discussion became heated and disorganized, Abigail, to her own astonishment, stood up. A hush fell over the room. She had never spoken at a meeting before. Her voice was quiet at first, but it gained strength as she spoke. "We have all spent so much time worrying about our own property lines," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. "We built our fences and posted our land, but a fire does not respect a fence line. A drought does not stop at a corner post." She took a breath, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. "Maybe we have been thinking about it all wrong. Maybe a fence is not just to keep people out. Maybe it is to show us where we have to start learning how to live together." She sat down, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed. A moment of silence was followed by a wave of applause. In that moment, she was no longer just the widow Finch, the reclusive schoolteacher. She was a leader in her community, a voice of reason. That night, after the cabin was quiet, Eli sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. He took the brass nail from his pocket. It felt smooth and solid in his calloused hand. It was a product of the modern world, of the railroad and the progress that had once seemed so threatening. But he had won it with his own knowledge, his own experience. He turned it over and over, the polished metal catching the faint starlight. It was strong and true. It was bright with promise. He began to imagine shaping it, bending it straight, unyielding form into a circle. The first rain of early summer came a week later. Not a violent hailstorm or a driving gale, but a soft, steady shower that drummed a peaceful rhythm on the roof of the new porch. It was a cleansing rain, washing the dust from the air and turning the valley a vibrant, hopeful green. The mail rider, a young man who usually galloped past with a wave, stopped at their gate, his slicker shining with water. He had a single, official-looking envelope. "This came through the main office in Cheyenne," he said, handing it to Abigail. "It is 5 years late, but the new postmaster is a stickler for getting things to their rightful place." The envelope was addressed to Eli Cutter, Mail Guard, Wyoming Territory. Inside was a formal letter of commendation from the United States Postal Service, citing his bravery in securing and protecting a registered mail pouch during the Black Creek robbery. It was dated a month after the incident. Tucked behind it was a note from the new postmaster, explaining that the commendation had been suppressed by the corrupt official Crane had been in league with, and had only just been discovered in a forgotten file. Eli read the letter, his face expressionless. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "I do not need a piece of paper to tell me what I did," he said, a familiar discomfort in his voice. He had never been a man who took well to praise. Abigail took his hand, her fingers warm on his. "The paper does not tell you what you did, Eli," she said softly. "It just confirms what everyone in this valley already sees." She tucked the letter into the ledger on the cottonwood desk, a final, official entry in the story of their survival. Their peace was interrupted one last time, not by a threat of violence, but by the long shadow of the law. Silas Merrick was in a federal jail awaiting trial. But his family, a wealthy and powerful clan from the east, was not content to let the matter rest. A lawyer from Cheyenne delivered a notice to Abigail. The Merrick family was filing a civil suit against her and Eli for the damages incurred during Merrick's arrest, claiming they had used excessive force and had maliciously conspired to ruin his reputation. It was a baseless, vindictive action, but they had the money to drag it through the courts for years. bleeding Abigail dry in legal fees. The lawyer, the same smooth man who had been at Merrick's side during the hearing, had a proposal for a settlement. "The Merrick family is prepared to withdraw the suit," he said, his voice oozing insincere reason, "in exchange for a formal, legally binding agreement granting them scheduled access to the creek on your property for their herds during the summer drive. A gesture of goodwill. You understand." It was the same demand Merrick had made from the beginning, now wrapped in the polite language of the law. The old anger, hot and sharp, flared in Abigail. After everything, they were still trying to take her water. But as she looked at Eli, she saw not anger in his eyes, but a deep, thoughtful calm. He had learned a different way to fight. That night, they discussed it. Her first instinct was to refuse, to fight them in court, to defend her borders to the last penny. "We won," she said, her voice tight. "We should not have to give them anything." "Justice is one thing," Eli said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "Living in a valley with your neighbors is another. His family will still be here long after he is gone. What is the victory if we win the fight but lose the peace?" He was right. Her speech at the town meeting came back to her. Her own words about learning to live together. It was a bitter pill to swallow, to offer a hand to the very people who had tried to crush her. But it was the only way forward. She met with the lawyer the next day. She agreed to the water access, but she added her own conditions. The access would be strictly scheduled, limited to a certain number of cattle at a time, and a member of the Merrick family, not just a hired hand, had to be present to oversee it. It was not a surrender. It was a treaty. It was justice and mercy, walking hand in hand. With the last external threat resolved, a quiet, internal one remained. One evening, as the rain fell softly on the porch roof, they sat in the comfortable silence that had grown between them. The day's work was done. The children's slates were clean for the next day. Eli was turning the brass nail over and over in his hand, a habit he had developed. "What are you afraid of now?" Eli Abigail asked, her voice gentle. The question was not an accusation, but an invitation. He was silent for a long time, watching the rain trace paths down the porch posts. "Before," he said, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear, "I was afraid of my past finding me. Now," he took a deep, shuddering breath, "now I am afraid of failing. I have never had anyone depend on me. Not really. What if the well runs dry? What if the calves are stillborn? What if there is a storm? I cannot build a roof strong enough to withstand. I am afraid of you needing me, and me not being enough." It was the raw, honest heart of the man who had faced down guns and fire and his own ghosts. It was his deepest vulnerability, laid bare in the soft, rainy dark. Abigail moved from her chair and knelt before him. She took his face in her hands, his skin rough and warm beneath her palms. She looked directly into his eyes, letting him see the absolute sincerity in her own. "I do not need you to be perfect, Eli," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that was stronger than gratitude, deeper than affection. "I do not need you to stop the storms. I just need you to come home each evening." His shoulders, which had been tense with the weight of his confession, finally relaxed. He leaned into her touch, a silent surrender. The last of the old ghosts had been laid to rest, not by a judge's decree, but by a quiet promise of acceptance. He stood then, pulling her gently to her feet. He led her into the cabin, to the great cottonwood desk that had become the center of their shared life. The rain pattered a soft, steady rhythm, a gentle witness. He took the single, bright brass nail from his pocket and placed it in the center of the desk, on a spot worn smooth by her father's hands, and then by hers. He went down on one knee. It was not a graceful movement. It was the clumsy, awkward motion of a man more comfortable with hammers and saws than with the delicate architecture of the heart. "Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I do not have a ring. I do not have much of anything to offer you. All I have is this nail. and these hands to build a life with. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She was smiling through them, a wide, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. She reached for one of the tin cans that still hung by a wire near the door, a relic of their first night on watch against the wolves. She unhooked it and held it out to him. "Then take this nail to Mr. Pike at the blacksmith's forge tomorrow," she said, her voice choked with laughter and tears. "Have him shape it into a ring. Make it so the head of the nail is still there, so it will clink when I wash my hands." She was turning their fear into their future, their alarm bell into their wedding band. He stood up and took her in his arms. The kiss was longer this time, deeper, a sealing of all the promises they had made, spoken and unspoken. It was full of the quiet hope of the rain and the solid strength of the house he had built around them. Their embrace was broken by a sudden, soft thud on the desk. Her calico cat, a creature of pure mischief, had leaped onto the desk, batted the shiny brass nail with its paw, and then, seizing it in its mouth, had jumped down and trotted proudly toward the open door. For a second, they stared in stunned silence. Then they both burst out laughing. The sound filled the small cabin, a joyous, uninhibited roar. He took her hand, and together they ran out into the soft summer rain, chasing a cat who had just stolen their future. The wedding was held in the backyard 2 weeks later, under the shade of the new porch. The whole town came. There was no fancy preacher, just the circuit judge, who said a few simple words. The children, all 7 of them, recited a poem they had written about a plum tree. The old men played fiddles, and the women brought so much cornbread and apple pie that the tables groaned under the weight. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, stood with a cup of punch in her hand, watching Abigail, who wore a simple blue dress and had a ring of hammered brass on her finger. She watched Eli, who stood beside his wife, his hand resting on her shoulder, a look of quiet, profound contentment on his face. She turned to the woman next to her and said, her voice devoid of all its former irony, full of a quiet wonder, "Well, I will be." She took in a ragged drifter, and he built her a ranch and a life she never dreamed of. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Eli took the old, faded foreclosure notice from the bank, the one that had started it all. He built a small fire in the hearth. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The next day, he took those ashes and mixed them into the mortar he used to set a new, wider windowsill in the cabin, a sill big enough for a pot of geraniums. The last remnant of their dark past was now part of the foundation of their home. Later, as they stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, they made a new set of vows. "Every season the wind blows," he said, his arm around her. "We will check the roof together." "Every season the rain fails," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We will share the water, together. And every time we are afraid," he finished, his voice a quiet promise in the gathering dusk, "we will tell the truth, together." The seasons turned in Bitterwash, and the valley healed. The news from the territorial court came on the autumn wind, carried by the same mail rider who had delivered Eli's long-delayed commendation. Samuel Crane was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for his crimes. Silas Merrick, thanks to his family's expensive lawyers, avoided prison, but he did not escape justice. He was fined a substantial sum in order to pay restitution to Abigail for the loss of her hay and the damage to her property. The first payment arrived a month later, not as a check in the mail, but delivered by hand by the family's lawyer. A quiet, formal admission of defeat. The Merrick clan, true to their word, adhered to the water-sharing agreement. The arrangement, born of conflict, became a fragile but functional bridge between the valley's most powerful family and its most resilient one. The society of Bitterwash, which had once bent toward the will of the strongest man, had been forced to recalibrate itself around the rule of law and the surprising strength of a quiet woman and the drifter who had come to stand beside her. Hope, in that valley, had the scent of plum blossoms. The following spring, the 3 small saplings Eli had planted by the creek burst into a cloud of delicate white flowers. The sight was a source of constant wonder for the children. They would finish their lessons and run down to the grove, their voices full of excited speculation about the fruit that would follow. The tin can alarm, which had once been a symbol of their fear, had been transformed. Each morning, young Sam, as the self-appointed bell ringer, would run to the fence line and shake the wire, the familiar, cheerful clatter echoing through the yard, calling the other children to their lessons. What had been designed to warn of danger now served as an invitation to learn. The themes of their life, the lessons they had learned in the crucible of the past year, settled into the foundation of their marriage. Their love was not a thing of breathless poetry or grand pronouncements. It was a partnership built of shared labor, of calloused hands meeting over a common task. It was a deep and abiding respect for the lines they had drawn around their own hearts, and the trust that allowed them to invite the other inside. It was the simple, difficult promise they had made to always tell the truth, especially when they were afraid. They had learned that justice was not always swift and not always perfect, but that it had a chance to arrive when ordinary people found the courage to do the right thing on the day it counted. The symbols of their struggle became the artifacts of their peace. The great cottonwood desk, which had once been Abigail's lonely command post, was now the heart of their shared home. It bore new scratches alongside the old ones left by her father, a faint ring from Eli's coffee cup, a small nick where a child's slate had slipped, the faint indentation where he had laid the brass nail. They were the marks of a life being lived, not just endured. On the porch, the mended water bucket still hung, its iron band a dark, proud scar. It reminded them that strength was not the absence of weakness, but the courage to repair what was broken. The new well, which Eli had dug from hopeless ground, gave water that was always sweet and clear. And the willow fence, which had begun as a line of bare sticks, was now a thick, living wall of green, its roots holding the precious soil in place. The mended bucket, the clear water, the green fence, it was the completed circle of their healing. The story of Abigail and Eli became a quiet legend in the valley, its pacing as natural as the turning of the seasons. It had begun slowly, a season of planting seeds of doubt and trust. It had built to a crescendo of fire and violence, a summer of reckoning. It had settled into a long, quiet autumn of rebuilding and reconciliation. The language of their life was written not in fancy words, but in the details of the senses, the feel of rough wood and cold iron, the taste of dust and the clean bite of well water, the sound of a hammer in the clear morning air. The humor they shared was the dry, essential wit of people who knew that tragedy was never far away, and that laughter was a necessary tool for survival. They had both grown into people they had never expected to be. Abigail, who had begun as a woman fiercely determined to hold her small piece of the world alone, had become the quiet, steady heart of her community. She had learned that the truest strength was not in keeping people out, but in knowing how and when to let them in. Eli, the man who had walked into the valley with nothing but the ghosts of his past, had become a man who was not afraid to put his name to the future. He had traded the anonymity of the road for the responsibility of a home, and in doing so, had finally found a place where he did not have to run. Every conflict that had defined their struggle had found its resolution. The internal battle with fear had been won by a commitment to courage. The external battle with Merrick and Crane had been settled not by the hammer, but by the law. The subtle war against a society's prejudice had been won by the simple, undeniable evidence of their integrity. The elemental struggle against nature, the wind, the drought, the fire had been met not with surrender, but with ingenuity, persistence, and the collective strength of their neighbors. Even the looming threat of technology, the railroad, had been faced not with anger, but with negotiation, turning a potential conflict into a partnership. The justice they had secured was tempered by the mercy they had shown. And the children of Bitterwash now had a living lesson in the quiet heroism of everyday decency. The feeling that settled over their ranch was not one of blissful, fairy tale happiness. It was something better, something more real. It was a feeling of earned peace, of solid, dependable trust. It was the quiet joy of a life built with one's own hands. The memory of their story was not in the grand events, but in the small, sensory details that linger, the cheerful clatter of a tin can bell, the sharp scent of pine pitch, the sweet, hopeful smell of plum blossoms on a spring morning. When the seasonal winds next swept through Bitterwash, the roof held firm. On the porch, a ring forged from a brass nail clinked softly against a water glass, the small sound of a new life. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and connect with fellow listeners. To hear more tales from the frontier, subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like and press that hype button to help share these stories with more people.